Failure is a teacher. Failure is a stepping stone. Failure is the path to success. Every successful person failed first. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. Fail forward, embrace failure, celebrate failure. Failure is not the opposite of success, it's part of success. The culture is saturated with failure mythology. Podcasts, commencement speeches, TED Talks, motivational books, entrepreneurial manifestos, all of them telling you that failure is good, that failure is necessary, that the willingness to fail is what separates the extraordinary from the mediocre, that the only real failure is the failure to try. The mythology sounds inspiring. It sounds democratic. It sounds like the universe treats everyone equally and the only variable is courage. But there's a question the mythology never asks. A question that would destroy the narrative if it were asked honestly. The question is this: what does failure cost you? Not what does failure teach you. Not what does failure build in you. Not what philosophical framework does failure slot into. What does failure cost you? In money, in time, in opportunity, in stability, in survival. Because the cost of failure is not the same for everyone. It has never been the same for everyone. And the entire failure mythology, the one that says failure is a gift and you should keep trying until you succeed, is built on the assumption that the cost of failure is survivable. That you can absorb the loss, that you can try again. That again is available to you. That again is something you can afford. For some people, again is infinite. The failed startup is funded by savings that still leave a 6-month cushion. The dropped-out semester is absorbed by parents who can pay for the restart. The career pivot that doesn't work out lands on the safety net of a spouse's income, a family home, an inheritance that prevents the failure from reaching the floor. For these people, the failure mythology is accurate. Failure is a teacher. Failure is a stepping stone. Because the ground beneath the stepping stone is soft, and the fall from the stone doesn't break anything that can't be repaired. For other people, again doesn't exist. The failed business wasn't funded by savings. It was funded by the last of everything. The rent money, the emergency fund that was already too small, the borrowed money from the family member who also had nothing to spare. The dropped semester doesn't land on a parental cushion. It lands on a debt that will take a decade to repay, and a gap in the resume that employers will use to justify the rejection that keeps the cycle running. The career pivot that doesn't work out doesn't land on a safety net. It lands on the concrete floor of a life with no margin, where the failure doesn't just teach. It takes. And what it takes cannot be tried again because again requires resources, and the resources were consumed by the first attempt. This audiobook is about the privilege of failure. The privilege that makes failure survivable for some and catastrophic for others. Not because of talent or effort or courage. Because of the floor beneath the attempt. 5 chapters. What the failure mythology hides. The actual economics of trying again. The compounding cost of failure without margin. Why the successful rarely see their own safety net. And what honest language about failure would sound like if the mythology stopped lying. 1 hour. This one won't be comfortable for anyone. If you've had the privilege of surviving failure, it will ask you to see what caught you. If you haven't, it will name what you've always known and rarely heard acknowledged. Both perspectives deserve the same hour. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Failure Mythology. What the narrative conveniently forgets. The failure mythology has a specific structure. It begins with a successful person standing on a stage or sitting behind a microphone or writing from the position of having already arrived, and it tells the story backwards. The story goes like this. I tried something. It didn't work. I tried again. It didn't work again. I kept trying. Eventually it worked. And the lesson that the audience is supposed to absorb and apply to their own lives, is that persistence through failure is what produces success. That the only difference between the person on the stage and the person in the audience is the willingness to keep going. The story is true. It's just not complete. The story leaves out the part that makes the story replicable. The part that determines whether the listener can actually follow the same path, or whether the path requires equipment the listener doesn't have. The missing part is the infrastructure of survival between the failures. When the tech entrepreneur tells the story of 3 failed startups before the 4th one succeeded, the story focuses on the courage to keep starting. The story does not focus on the apartment that was paid for during the gaps. The savings account that funded the living expenses, while the failed businesses produced no income. The health insurance that continued through the failures, because it was provided by a spouse, or a previous employer, or a family plan that the entrepreneur didn't have to purchase from the depleted funds that the failure left behind. The social network that provided introductions to investors for attempt number 4, a network built through college connections, family relationships, and the social capital that accompanies a certain economic position. The story doesn't focus on these things because including them would change the moral. The moral would shift from be brave enough to fail to be resourced enough to survive the failure. And that moral doesn't sell. This is crucial. The failure mythology performs a specific ideological function. It attributes the difference between the person who succeeds after failure and the person who doesn't succeed after failure to internal qualities: courage, grit, resilience, determination, the willingness to keep going when things are hard. These are real qualities and they matter. Nobody is arguing that persistence doesn't contribute to outcomes. But the mythology treats these internal qualities as if they are sufficient. As if courage plus failure equals eventual success, regardless of circumstance. And the treatment of internal qualities as sufficient erases the external conditions that determine whether the internal qualities have room to operate. Courage without a financial cushion is courage that can't afford to fail. Grit without a safety net is grit that breaks when the fall has no floor. Resilience without resources is resilience that rebuilds with nothing, which isn't resilience. It's desperation. The internal qualities the mythology celebrates are necessary, but they are not sufficient. And the mythology's refusal to name the external conditions that make those qualities usable is not an oversight. It's the mechanism by which the mythology protects the narrative that success is purely a matter of individual character. Because if success is purely a matter of individual character, then failure is purely a matter of individual deficiency. And if failure is individual deficiency, then the structural conditions that make failure catastrophic for some and trivial for others are not the system's problem. They're the individual's problem. The mythology doesn't just celebrate failure. It privatizes it. Most people miss this about why the failure mythology is so persistent despite its obvious incompleteness. The mythology serves the people who succeeded. The person on the stage who tells the failure story has arrived at a position where the failures are retrospectively useful. The failures make a good story. The failures demonstrate character. The failures add texture to the success narrative. But the failures were survivable. And the survivability, which is the most important variable in the story, is the variable the storyteller has the least incentive to examine, because examining it would reveal that the success was not purely a product of the storyteller's character. It was partly a product of conditions the storyteller didn't earn, didn't build, and often didn't even notice. The safety net is invisible to the person standing on it. It's only visible to the person falling without one. Chapter 2: The Economics of Try Again. What another attempt actually costs. The phrase "try again" contains an assumption so fundamental that it's invisible. The assumption is that again is available, that the resources consumed by the first attempt can be regenerated for a second attempt, that the time lost in the first failure can be recovered, that the opportunity consumed by the first try will present itself a second time, that the financial cost of the first failure leaves enough remaining for another investment. Try again assumes a surplus, a margin, a reserve of resources beyond what the first attempt required. And the presence or absence of that surplus is the single most accurate predictor of whether failure leads to eventual success, or whether failure leads to a deeper, more permanent, more difficult-to-escape version of the position the person was trying to escape in the first place. The financial cost of trying again. The first attempt costs whatever it costs. The business that required $10,000 in startup capital. The education that required tuition, fees, books, and the living expenses during the period when the education consumed the hours that would otherwise have produced income. The career transition that required months of reduced or eliminated income while the new skill was developed, while the certification was pursued, while the market was tested. The move to the city where the opportunity exists, requiring first and last month's rent, a security deposit, the cost of physically relocating, transportation costs, TS, and the daily survival expenses of a new environment where the social support network that previously reduced costs through shared resources and mutual aid is entirely absent. When the first attempt fails, the financial cost is not just the money spent. It's the money spent plus the money not earned during the period of the attempt plus the debt accumulated to fund the gap between expenses and income during the attempt plus the depletion of any savings that existed before the attempt began plus the penalties, fees, and increased interest rates that accumulate when the financial strain causes payments to slip. The net financial position after a failed first attempt is not zero. It's not back to the starting line, it's behind the starting line. The person is further from stability than they were before they tried, and try again means starting from behind. Starting with less money than you had the first time, with more debt than you had before, with fewer savings, with a credit score damaged by the payments missed during the attempt, a credit score that now makes borrowing more expensive, renting harder, and even employment more difficult because employers in many places check credit as part of the hiring process. The failure didn't just cost the investment. It damaged the infrastructure that the next attempt would need to function. For the person with margin, starting from behind is uncomfortable but survivable. The savings absorb the loss and there's still a cushion remaining. Maybe a smaller cushion. Maybe an uncomfortable cushion. But a cushion. The family provided a bridge, a place to stay, a meal, a loan with no interest and no deadline, and the bridge is still available for a second crossing because the family's resources weren't depleted by providing it. The spouse's income maintained the household during the attempt, and the household remained stable. The failure cost money, real money, but the money can be recovered through the continued earning capacity that the margin preserved. The credit wasn't destroyed because the margin prevented the missed payments. The apartment wasn't lost because the rent was covered. The health insurance continued because it was never dependent on the attempt's success. The person can try again because the infrastructure of their life survived the failure intact. For the person without margin, starting from behind is not a temporary setback that resolves with the next paycheck. It's a descent into a territory where each step downward makes the next step upward harder. The savings were already minimal and are now gone entirely. Not reduced, gone. The debt accumulated during the attempt is now accruing interest on top of the debt that already existed before the attempt, the credit card balance that was already being managed, the student loans that were already consuming a percentage of income. The family who loaned money didn't have it to spare. The loan came from their own thin margin, and the inability to repay on time has damaged the relationship, and the bridge has been weakened or burned. The employment gap created by the attempt has produced a credibility deficit with employers who will see the gap and draw conclusions that have nothing to do with the person's ability, but everything to do with the system's use of resume gaps as filtering mechanisms. Try again. With what resources? On what foundation? Using what credit? With whose support? This is crucial. The financial cost of failure is not linear. It's exponential for the person without margin. When you start with a surplus and lose some of the surplus, you still have a surplus. When you start with nothing and lose something, you go below nothing. Below nothing means debt. Debt means interest. Interest means the hole is getting deeper on its own, automatically every month, without any additional failure being required. The person is descending while standing still. The person with margin loses a percentage of their buffer. The buffer regenerates through continued earning. The loss is temporary. The person without margin loses their floor, and below the floor is not a temporary position. It's a gravitational field. The debt pulls downward. The damaged credit pulls downward. The stress pulls downward. The impaired cognition pulls downward. And each downward pull makes the upward climb steeper, more exhausting, more cognitively demanding, at exactly the moment when the person has fewer resources available for the climb. The time cost of trying again. Time is the resource that the failure mythology treats most carelessly because time is the resource that the mythology's primary audience, the young and the privileged, has in greatest abundance. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Keep going. The timeline doesn't matter. Only the destination matters. This language sounds liberating. It sounds like the removal of the clock, the elimination of the pressure, the gift of infinite runway. But the language contains an assumption that only applies to people for whom time is genuinely abundant. People who are young enough that decades of working life stretch ahead. People who are healthy enough that the body will sustain the effort across multiple cycles of failure and recovery and failure again. People whose responsibilities, the mortgage, the children, the aging parents, the medical needs, don't impose time constraints that make extended timelines impossible regardless of the person's willingness to persist. The 22-year-old who fails has 40 years of working life remaining. 40 years is a vast expanse. The failure at 22 is absorbed by a timeline that includes dozens of opportunities, hundreds of possible pivots, and the biological energy of a young body that can sustain the long hours and the high stress that rebuilding requires. The 40-year-old who fails has 20 years remaining. The 50-year-old has 10 or 15. And the difference is not just numerical, it's structural. The 22-year-old's failure is a small percentage of their total capacity. The 40-year-old's failure consumes a much larger percentage. Each failed attempt at 40 costs proportionally more of the remaining timeline than the same attempt at 22. The opportunities that were abundant at 22, when the market viewed you as a developing asset, are scarcer at 40 when the market views you as a depreciating one. The energy available for the restart is different at 40 than at 22. The responsibilities are heavier. The dependents are more vulnerable. The margin for error has contracted. Try again at 22 means something fundamentally different than try again at 45. The mythology doesn't acknowledge the difference because acknowledging it would require admitting that the advice is age-dependent, circumstance-dependent, resource-dependent, responsibility-dependent, and therefore not universal. Universal advice is the only kind the mythology sells because universal advice reaches the largest audience and specific advice, the kind that would actually help the person evaluate their situation accurately, reaches only the people in that specific situation. And reaching everyone is more profitable than helping someone. The opportunity cost of trying again. Every attempt consumes not just the resources invested in the attempt, but also the alternative uses of those resources. The money spent on the failed business could have been invested in retirement savings that would have compounded for decades. The 2 years spent on the failed career pivot could have been spent advancing in the existing career, building seniority, accumulating the stability that makes future risk possible rather than catastrophic. The emotional energy consumed by the failed attempt could have been invested in the relationships that sustain a person through difficulty. Every failed attempt for the person without margin doesn't just consume the direct investment. It consumes the opportunity that the investment represented. And the opportunity, unlike the money, cannot be borrowed, cannot be given by family, cannot be recovered through future earnings. The opportunity was a specific window in time, and the window has closed, and no amount of trying again opens a closed window. Chapter 3. The Compounding Cost. What happens when failure has no floor? When the failure mythology says failure is temporary, the mythology is describing the experience of failure with margin, the experience where the loss is absorbed, the lesson is extracted, and the next attempt proceeds from a position that, while diminished, remains functional. This is the version of failure that produces the TED Talk, the version that generates the inspirational story, the version where failure is a chapter in the success narrative rather than the end of the narrative entirely. But there is another version of failure, the version where the failure isn't temporary because the consequences aren't temporary. The version where the loss cascades into additional losses that weren't part of the original risk calculation. The version where one failure triggers a sequence of failures that compound until the person is so far below their starting position that the very concept of trying again becomes absurd. This is the version of failure that never makes it to the stage. Not because the people who experience it lack courage or insight or the capacity to tell a compelling story, because they're still in it, still dealing with the consequences, still trying to reach the floor that the mythology assumes everyone starts from. The cascade. A person without margin attempts the thing the mythology says to attempt, the small business, the career change, the educational investment, the move to the city where the opportunity supposedly exists. The attempt fails, not because the person was less talented or less courageous or less determined than the person whose identical attempt succeeded. Not because they wanted it less, not because they worked fewer hours, not because their idea was worse or their execution was weaker or their commitment was half-hearted, because the market shifted during the critical window, because the timing was wrong by 3 months and 3 months was the difference between catching the wave and drowning in it. Because the funding was insufficient to survive the gap between launch and revenue, and the insufficiency was not a planning failure but a resource reality. Because any of the 1,000 variables that determine outcomes and that have nothing to do with individual character produce the failure instead of the success. The same variables that, when they aligned favorably for the person with margin, produced the success story that became the TED Talk. The failure consumes the investment. The money is gone. The time is gone. And now the consequences begin their independent cascade. The rent falls behind because the income that was supposed to be generated by the attempt wasn't generated, and the savings that were supposed to bridge the gap ran out 2 weeks before the attempt died. The rent that falls behind triggers the late fee. $35, a trivial amount to the person with margin, a detonator for the person without. Because the late fee, added to the already strained budget, means the credit card payment is missed. The missed credit card payment triggers the penalty interest rate. The rate jumps from 15% to 29%. The jump increases the monthly minimum payment. The increased minimum means the phone bill is delayed. The delayed phone bill results in disconnection after the grace period expires. The disconnected phone means the job callback, the callback from the employer who was going to offer the position that would have stopped the cascade, is missed. Missed because the phone was disconnected. Because the phone bill was delayed, because the credit card minimum increased, because the penalty rate activated, because the payment was missed, because the late fee consumed the margin, because the rent was late, because the business failed, because the market shifted. The callback goes to voicemail. The voicemail box is full because the phone was disconnected. The employer moves to the next candidate, someone whose phone was still connected, Someone whose margin, however thin, absorbed the initial loss before it could cascade. Someone who is no more talented, no more qualified, no more deserving, but whose financial infrastructure kept the phone connected during the critical 72 hours. This is crucial. The cascade is not a failure of character. It's not a failure of effort. It's not a failure of talent or willingness or the courage that the mythology celebrates. It's a failure of margin. The same initial loss, the same failed business, the same market shift, the same timing that was wrong by 3 months produces a minor setback for the person with $10,000 in accessible savings and a catastrophic chain reaction for the person with 200. The chain reaction is not proportional to the size of the loss. It's proportional to the absence of the buffer. The buffer is the difference between the loss being absorbed and the loss being amplified. Between the failure being a story you tell later and the failure being the event that reorganized your life downward. A $500 unexpected expense is an inconvenience for the person with a financial cushion. The same $500 expense is a crisis for the person who was already spending every dollar before it arrived. The crisis triggers consequences. The consequences trigger additional crises. Each additional crisis is harder to manage because each one arrives when the person has fewer resources than they had when the previous crisis hit. And the compounding has no natural stopping point because the person without margin has no mechanism to interrupt the cascade once it begins. The circuit breaker that would stop the chain reaction is money, and money is what the person doesn't have. That's why they're in the cascade in the first place. The mythology says, fail fast, fail often. The mythology assumes that the cost of each failure is small enough to absorb, that multiple failures can be accumulated without the accumulation becoming an insurmountable burden. This is true when margin exists. When margin doesn't exist, failing fast and often means descending fast and often. Each failure removes resources that make the next attempt less likely to succeed, because the next attempt is being launched from a lower position with fewer resources, more stress, less cognitive bandwidth, less emotional capacity, and the accumulated damage of the previous failures weighing on every decision. Most people miss this about why the cascade creates a qualitatively different kind of failure than the mythology describes. The cascade doesn't just reduce resources, it reduces capacity. The stress of financial crisis impairs the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, and the cognitive functions that the next attempt requires. Research has demonstrated that the cognitive bandwidth consumed by financial scarcity is equivalent to the cognitive impairment of losing an entire night's sleep. The person trying again after a cascading failure is not just trying with less money. They're trying with less brain, less cognitive capacity, less ability to plan effectively, evaluate opportunities accurately, and make the strategic decisions that the next attempt demands. The mythology says failure makes you smarter. The cascade makes you cognitively impaired. And the impairment caused by the stress of the failure's consequences makes the next failure more likely, which makes the next cascade more severe, which makes the impairment worse. The spiral tightens with each rotation. Chapter 4. The Invisible Net. Why the Successful Can't See Their Own Privilege. The safety net is invisible to the person standing on it. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of how human cognition processes structural advantage. The psychological mechanisms that prevent the successful person from seeing their safety net are not moral failures. They're cognitive features that operate automatically and that require deliberate effort to override. The attribution bias. Human beings are wired to attribute their successes to internal factors and their failures to external factors. When you succeed, you see your effort, your talent, your persistence, your character. When you fail, you see the circumstances, the bad luck, the unfair conditions, the obstacles that were placed in your path. This asymmetry is called the self-serving attribution bias, and it operates in everyone's cognition regardless of education, intelligence, or moral character. The bias means that the person who succeeded after failure sees their courage and persistence as the primary cause of the success. The financial cushion that made the persistence possible is not experienced as a cause. It's experienced as a background condition, like oxygen, like gravity, present but not noticed, not credited, not included in the story because it doesn't feel like part of the story. The courage feels like the story. The money feels like the setting, and nobody credits the setting. The survivorship filter. The stories the culture tells about failure are exclusively the stories of people who survived it. This seems obvious when stated plainly, but the implications are profound and are almost never examined. The person who failed 3 times and succeeded on the 4th attempt stands on the stage and tells the story. The story has a narrative arc: beginning, struggle, persistence, triumph. The story is compelling, inspirational, and deeply misleading because the person telling it is selected by the filter of having survived. The person who failed 3 times and was destroyed by the cascade and never recovered does not tell the story. Not because they don't exist. They exist in enormous numbers. Not because they lack the intelligence or the eloquence to tell it. Not because their story is less interesting or less instructive or less true. Because they're not on stages. They're not writing books from the position of having arrived. They're not producing podcasts from home studios purchased with the proceeds of the success that followed the failure. They're working the job that the cascade forced them into, paying the debt that the cascade generated, debt that is still growing because the interest doesn't stop, living the life that the cascade produced, a life organized not around ambition or dreams or the mythology's promises, but around the bare requirements of preventing the cascade from descending further. They don't have the time, the platform, the credibility, or the emotional resources to tell their story. And the absence of their story from the cultural conversation creates the illusion that all failure stories end in success. Because the only failure stories anyone ever hears are the ones told by people who succeeded eventually. The survivorship filter means that every story the culture tells about failure is told by someone for whom failure was survivable. And the survivability of the storyteller is presented as evidence that failure is universally survivable when it's actually evidence that the specific storyteller had the specific conditions, the margin, the network, the demographic advantages, the family infrastructure, the timing, the luck, that made survival possible in their specific case. The filter removes the counter-evidence with perfect efficiency. The stories that would complicate the mythology, the stories where courage and persistence and genuine willingness to fail and try again did not produce success because the conditions required for success to follow failure were absent, are never told at scale. Not because they're rare, because the people living them are too busy surviving the consequences to package the experience into content. This is crucial. The invisibility of the safety net to the person standing on it means that the successful person's advice about failure is not advice drawn from their complete experience. It's advice drawn from the visible portion of their experience, the portion that feels like their story, while the invisible portion, the portion that made the story possible, is absent from the telling because it's absent from the teller's awareness. The visible portion includes the internal qualities, the courage to start, the persistence to continue, the resilience to absorb the loss and try again, the willingness to endure the discomfort of uncertainty. These are real and they matter. The invisible portion includes the external conditions, the financial margin that kept the rent paid during the gap, the social capital that provided the introduction to the investor for attempt number 2, the family support that absorbed the living expenses during the recovery period, the health insurance that continued without interruption because it was attached to a spouse's employment rather than the failed venture, the educational credential that made the fallback employment available, the stable job that funded the runway for the next attempt, the demographic alignment that meant the interviewer saw potential rather than risk, competence rather than gamble, future rather than liability. The advice addresses the visible portion. Be brave, be persistent, be willing to fail. The advice ignores the invisible portion because the advisor doesn't see the invisible portion. And the listener, who may or may not possess the invisible portion, is left to assume that the visible portion, the courage and the persistence, is all that's needed, that the internal qualities are sufficient, that the structural conditions are details. And the listener who follows the advice without the conditions discovers, through the cascade, through the compounding, through the descent that the mythology never described because the mythology's storytellers never experienced it, that courage was necessary. But it was never sufficient. The normalization of advantage. The person who grew up with resources doesn't experience those resources as advantage. This is not a moral failing, it's a cognitive one. The human brain establishes its baseline of normal during childhood and early adulthood. Whatever conditions surround you during the period when your understanding of the world is being formed become the definition of normal. Not advantaged, not privileged. Normal, just how things are. The family that could absorb a financial setback without crisis is just a family. That's what families do. The school that provided connections to alumni networks and professional opportunities is just a school. That's what schools do. The neighborhood that offered physical safety, well-maintained public spaces, and the ambient stability that allows a developing brain to focus on growth rather than survival is just a neighborhood. That's what neighborhoods are. The normal of the advantaged person is invisible to them precisely because it's normal. It requires no explanation. It draws no attention. It's the water the fish swims in. The absence of the resources. which is the daily reality of the person without margin, the reality where the family cannot absorb the setback, where the school didn't provide the network, where the neighborhood didn't provide the safety, is as unimaginable to the person who has always had them as the presence of those resources is aspirational to the person who has never had access to any of them. The gap between these two normals is the gap the mythology ignores. And the gap, not the courage, not the persistence, not any internal quality, is what determines whether failure is a chapter or the end of the story. Most people miss this about why conversations about the privilege of failure become so contentious. The person who succeeded after failure feels that the attribution of their success to privilege diminishes their effort. And their effort was real. Their courage was real. Their persistence was genuine. The late nights and the early mornings and the fear they pushed through were authentic experiences. Nobody is saying the effort wasn't real. What's being said is that the effort occurred within conditions that allowed the effort to produce its result. The same effort, the same courage, the same persistence, deployed in the absence of those conditions, would have produced a different outcome. Not because the person was different, because the conditions were different. And the conditions, more than the effort, determined whether the failure was a stepping stone or a trapdoor. Chapter 5. Honest language. What we'd say if we stopped lying about failure. If the failure mythology were honest, it would sound different. Not discouraging. Different. It would acknowledge what is true without pretending that what is true is simple. It would honor the effort while naming the conditions. It would inspire without lying. Here is what honest language about failure would include. Honest language would name the cost before encouraging the attempt. Instead of just go for it, the worst that can happen is you fail and learn something. Honest language would say, here is what this attempt will cost if it fails. Here is the financial exposure. Here is the time investment. Here is the opportunity cost. Here is the recovery timeline. Can you survive this cost? If you can, the attempt is rational. If you can't, the attempt is a gamble with consequences that extend far beyond the lesson the mythology promises. Honest language would distinguish between failure with margin and failure without. Instead of treating all failure as equivalent, honest language would acknowledge that the experience of failing while financially stable and the experience of failing while financially precarious are so different that they barely belong in the same category. One is an education. The other is a crisis. Calling both failure and prescribing the same response, try again, is like calling both a sprained ankle and a compound fracture leg problems and prescribing the same treatment. The sprained ankle needs rest and time. The compound fracture needs surgery and months of rehabilitation. Treating the compound fracture with rest and time doesn't produce healing. It produces permanent damage. This is crucial. Honest language would stop using successful people's failure stories as universal prescriptions. The tech founder who failed 3 times before succeeding is not proof that persistence pays off for everyone. The tech founder is proof that persistence pays off when it's accompanied by the financial margin, the social capital, the educational credentials, the demographic advantages, and the infrastructure of survival that allowed 3 failures to occur without catastrophic consequences. Telling the story without naming those conditions is not inspiration. It's misinformation. And the misinformation produces real harm when the person without those conditions follows the prescription and discovers that the same failure that was a stepping stone for the founder is a trapdoor for them. Honest language would validate the decision not to try. The mythology treats the refusal to attempt as cowardice, as a character deficiency, as evidence that the person didn't want it badly enough. The person who stays in the stable job instead of pursuing the entrepreneurial dream is labeled as afraid, as settling, as lacking the courage to risk failure, as being one of the mediocre many who watch from the sidelines while the brave few take the field. The language is designed to shame, to prod, to use the fear of being ordinary as the lever that pushes people toward the risk. But the person who stays in the stable job because the stable job is the only thing standing between their family and the cascade, the only source of health insurance for their child with a chronic condition that requires specialist appointments and medication that costs more per month than the deductible would suggest. The only income that keeps the rent paid in a housing market with zero vacancy for error. The only financial floor beneath a family that has been one unexpected expense away from crisis for years. That person is not a coward. That person is not settling. That person is not afraid of failure in the way the mythology means it. That person is terrified of the specific consequences that failure would produce for people who depend on them. And the terror is not irrational. It's accurate. It's a precise, informed assessment of what failure would actually cost in their specific circumstances. A cost that the mythology never quantifies, because quantifying it would make the mythology's advice irresponsible rather than inspiring. Their refusal to gamble with their family's stability is not a failure of courage. It's an exercise of the most difficult kind of responsibility, the kind that requires you to absorb the daily weight of unfulfilled potential, of the road not taken, of the dream that remains a dream because the conditions that would make its pursuit rational have not been assembled yet. That person is managing risk with the precision that their circumstances demand. And the precision, the caution, the refusal to take the leap without the safety net is invisible courage. The courage that never gets the TED Talk. The courage that the mythology doesn't recognize because it doesn't produce the dramatic narrative of failure and triumph. It produces the quiet, unglamorous, relentless discipline of providing, day after day, year after year, while the dream waits. Honest language would acknowledge the structural. Instead of anyone can make it if they work hard enough and are willing to fail enough times, honest language would say something that the mythology finds unbearable to say. Some people face structural barriers that make failure more costly, more frequent, and more difficult to recover from than it is for others. The barriers are real. The barriers are measurable. The barriers are not a reflection of the individual's character or effort or courage. They're a reflection of the system's design, a system that distributes margin unevenly based on factors that have nothing to do with merit and everything to do with circumstance. This is not victim language. This is not the language of excuses. This is accurate language. The system produces different outcomes for different people based on their starting position. The starting position includes family wealth, geographic location, demographic category, educational access, health status, and the accumulated advantages or disadvantages that compound across generations. Naming the starting position is not making excuses for failure. It's providing the information that the person needs to make an honest, clear-eyed assessment of their risk, their timeline, their available resources, and the actual probability, not the mythology's probability but the actual probability, that the attempt will produce the result the mythology promises. Most people miss this about what honest language would accomplish if it replaced the mythology. Honest language wouldn't discourage attempts. It wouldn't create a culture of fear and inaction. It wouldn't produce a generation of people who refuse to try anything because the risk has been accurately named. Honest language would produce the opposite. It would make attempts more strategic, more informed, more likely to succeed because the person attempting has a realistic understanding of what the attempt requires and has built the conditions that the mythology skips over in its rush to celebrate the leap. The person without margin who receives honest information about the cost of failure doesn't stop trying. They try differently. They try with more awareness of their constraints and more creativity about working within them. They build the margin before the attempt rather than discovering its absence during the failure. They pursue the stable income first, not because they've abandoned the dream, but because the stable income is the safety net that makes the dream's failure survivable. The stable income is the floor that the mythology assumes everyone already has. They try in smaller increments, testing the business idea on weekends while the paycheck funds the rent, validating the market with a minimal investment before committing the full resource, building the runway before the flight rather than jumping off the cliff, and hoping the wings the mythology promised materialize on the way down. Honest language produces smarter risk, calculated risk, risk that has been measured against actual conditions rather than mythological promises. The mythology produces uninformed gambling dressed in the language of courage. And the gambling, when it fails for the person without margin, produces consequences that no amount of mythology can undo. Closing thoughts. The question the mythology never asks. The mythology says fail and try again. The mythology says failure is a teacher. The mythology says the willingness to fail is what separates the successful from the stuck. And the mythology isn't wrong about any of these things in isolation. Taken individually, each statement contains truth. Failure can teach. Persistence can produce results. The willingness to take risks is a genuine component of the outcomes the culture celebrates. Nobody is arguing that effort and courage are irrelevant. They're profoundly relevant. They're necessary components of every outcome worth pursuing. But the mythology is incomplete, dangerously incomplete, harmfully incomplete, incomplete in ways that produce real consequences for real people who follow the advice without possessing the conditions the advice assumes. Because the mythology never asks the question that determines whether its advice is helpful or destructive. The question is not, are you willing to fail? Everybody is asked that question. The question the mythology never asks, the question that would destroy its universality and therefore its commercial viability, is, can you afford to? Can you afford the financial cost of the failure? Not the inspirational cost, not the growth cost, the actual financial cost, The dollars, the debt, the missed payments, the damaged credit, the depleted savings, the cascade. Can you afford the time, not abstractly, specifically? Given your age, your responsibilities, your health, your dependence, can you afford to lose the months or years that the failed attempt will consume? Can you afford the opportunity cost, the alternative uses of the money, the time, the energy, the cognitive bandwidth that the attempt will require? Can you afford the cognitive impairment that the stress of financial crisis produces if the attempt fails and the cascade begins? Can your family afford it? Can your children afford the instability that the failed attempt would produce in their home, their school, their sense of security? Can the people who depend on your stability afford the consequence of your courage? If the answer is yes, genuinely yes, based on an honest assessment of your margin rather than the mythology's assurance that everything will work out, then the mythology is your friend. Fail boldly. Fail often. Learn fast. Try again. The net is there. The fall is survivable. The lesson is real and the recovery is possible, and the next attempt can proceed from a position that, while diminished, remains functional. The mythology was written for you. Its advice applies. Its promises hold. If the answer is no, then the mythology is not your friend. The mythology is a narrative constructed by people who could afford to fail, told from stages they reached because their failures were survivable, broadcast to audiences that include millions of people for whom the same failures would be catastrophic, wrapped in the language of universal truth when it is actually the specific truth of the specifically privileged. Following the mythology's advice without the mythology's conditions doesn't produce the mythology's results. It produces the cascade, the compounding, the descent, the consequences that the mythology never mentions because the mythology's storytellers never experienced them, and the people who did experience them are not the people with microphones. You are not a coward for not risking everything. You are not weak for choosing stability over spectacle. You are not less courageous for refusing to follow advice that was not designed for your circumstances. You are not settling for building the foundation before attempting the structure. You are not less than the person on the stage because your courage takes a different form. Because your courage shows up as the daily discipline of providing, of holding the line, of maintaining the stability that your dependents require, rather than the dramatic leap that the mythology celebrates. The person who builds the margin first, who creates the safety net through years of unglamorous financial discipline before the attempt, who constructs the floor so that the failure, if it comes, has somewhere to land that isn't their family's stability, that person isn't settling. They're not playing it safe. They're building the infrastructure that makes meaningful risk possible rather than reckless. They're doing the work the mythology skips over, the work that doesn't make the TED Talk. The work that makes the TED Talk possible for the person who eventually gives it. Build the floor first, then jump. Not because you're afraid, because you're wise enough to know that courage without a floor isn't courage. It's a fall with no landing. And the people who survive the falls and live to tell the stories that inspire the world are rarely the bravest among us. They're the ones who had somewhere safe to land. The bravest ones are still climbing out of the hole the mythology told them to jump into. And nobody is telling their story.